Hey guys, it's Cody. I'm on day 84 of the Odin project, and today I kept working on the final JavaScript project and continued learning with my data structures and algorithms strategy. For the final JavaScript project, there were three things that I did today. The first thing that I did was add an event listener to monitor when the user was pressing down on the enter key. I wanted to do this so that it would allow the user to submit the data by pressing the enter key, since that is a normal thing that happens in classic HTML forms. In addition to that, I did some basic form validation, checking if the user's inputs are empty, and if they are empty, showing them error messages to inform them that they have to add information to actually submit the data. For the data structures and algorithms, it was still just learning Python, and then I did start reading the Python DS3 textbook online. So not much going on there, but let's dive into what I did specifically with the final JavaScript project. So let's take a look at the screen. Okay guys, so up in the top right corner, we have my add lexicon form. It's extremely simple right now. It's not a great UI, but that's okay. I'm building it as we go. So the first thing that I noticed with this form today, if you add data to it, it will submit if you click it. And so I know that because the document written with ID gives me back an ID and it doesn't give me the error message, error adding document. So that was good, but I tested a different way. I added some data, and then instead of pressing with the cursor, I pressed enter, and it would continue on to this page, but I never saw the ID actually coming out down here. We see that now because I fixed it, but it wasn't working earlier. So in order to fix that, I took a look at what was going on. I did some searching, and I was trying to just utilize like the default submit enter with a default form. What I ended up doing was there's this function handle submit that I actually have tied to the on click event for this button, and that's why I was actually able to submit data with doing that. But I needed to tie in this handle submit to the enter press as well. So in order to do that, I had to create a hook with use effect that would take this on enter press submit data function and add it as an event on key down. So I'm adding an event listener for key down, and when it actually happens, this function will fire. The event will be passed as a parameter or as an argument. And within here, we have some conditional logic to check the event code if it's enter or the numpad enter. It'll prevent the default, which will prevent the form from kind of going forward since it is a form. And then it will actually run that handle submit function like I want it to, which is why we're now seeing the data actually submitting down here. So that was the first thing that I finished today. In addition to that, I realized that I didn't have any form validation going on, so I decided to work on that a little bit. And if we take a look within our handle submit data, that's where I'm doing the form validation. So I'm getting the values for the two inputs for this form, and I'm going to be putting them in an inputs array with their corresponding label, essentially what they're called. And then I actually use that inputs array to check if the inputs are not empty. And if they are not empty, then it will just use this try catch to attempt entering the data to the database. And if there is an empty input within that array, then it's going to run this else piece of code down here, and it will set the empty input state to the return value of find empty inputs, which takes inputs array as an argument. So we're going to take a look at those two functions, check inputs not empty and find empty inputs up here. So here's our check inputs not empty. It takes that inputs array, which has objects as its items, and within each object it is an input that has a value property and also a label property. For this specific function, we're primarily looking at the value property. The first thing that we do is set a negative condition. So I'm going to be using this sum method on the array, and this sum method is going to return true if there is an input that has a value that is equal to an empty string. So if there is an empty input, it will return true. So I wanted to have the negative condition. It's a little bit confusing, but negative condition relative to what the description of this function is, so the function name. And so when there is an empty input, that will then set this negative condition to true, and then we're going to negate that condition to actually return whether or not the check inputs are not empty. And so if there is an input that is equal, that has a value that's equal to an empty string, then it is going to come back it's going to return true for this negative condition and ultimately return false. And so that would say that check inputs not empty is false. If it's false, it's going to actually skip over the try catch for entering the database, and it's going to run this function within this set empty inputs. So find empty inputs will be run within set empty input. Find empty inputs takes that inputs array again, and it's going to filter for inputs that have a value that is equal to an empty string. That array will then be returned, and as I mentioned earlier, it's going to go to the set empty inputs as an argument. It's going to change our empty inputs. So let's go back down here. So here's that find empty inputs function. It's going to take that inputs array, find the empty inputs, return them as an array, and then set empty inputs is going to set the empty inputs state. Since state has been modified, it's actually going to then re-render, and we're re-rendering this down here and within the div with class name errors. Specifically, the empty inputs are going to be mapped over, and each input is then going to render a div that says the input label cannot be empty. And so let's take a look at what this actually looks like. If I click add lexicon here, both of these are empty, so we get both of these error messages. So product category cannot be empty and product cannot be empty. And then if I add a value to product category, then product cannot be empty. And if I add a value to product, then it will actually submit, and we do see document written with ID. So that's some very basic form validation. I'm satisfied with it for right now because I don't have strict data that I'm looking for those two specific inputs. But this form validation and setting up these events is going to be useful because I'm going to be utilizing that within these additional forms as we take them through the lexicon management system process. That's all I have for you guys today. The data structures and algorithms, as I mentioned, I'm continuing learning with that. I don't have a lot, pretty much me just reading Python documentation and just getting an understanding of syntax. I am starting to actually go into the algorithms a bit with the Python DS3 textbook, but that's all I have for today, guys. So thanks for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe if you'd like to follow mine and Emily's journeys into web dev. See you guys tomorrow.